You said no to something small last week, and then you spent the next 4 minutes explaining why. Nobody asked for the explanation. You just gave it. Unprompted. A little too fast, a little too detailed. Reasons stacked on reasons, like you were building a case in a courtroom nobody had actually convened. Most people never notice how often this happens, because the habit has become so automatic it barely registers as a choice anymore. Here's the strange part. Even while you were talking, some quiet corner of your mind was watching you do it, slightly embarrassed, wondering why a simple no needed a legal defense behind it. Picture the actual scene, because it's more familiar than most people want to admit. A coworker asks if you can help with something on Saturday. You don't want to. You say no. And then, almost immediately, the paragraph arrives uninvited. You got a family thing, actually more than one thing, and you've been meaning to catch up on rest anyway, and honestly the week's been a lot, and you really wish you could help, but the timing just isn't great right now. The coworker who asked a single yes or no question nods along through all of it, waiting for you to finish, probably having accepted your no somewhere around the third word. You just didn't stop talking long enough to notice they'd already moved on. You do this more than you realize. Declining an invitation, leaving a party early, choosing not to answer a text right away, feeling a certain way about something. Every one of these small, ordinary human moments, and somehow, every single time, a justification shows up right behind it, like it's mandatory paperwork attached to having a preference at all. Now think about the people you know who don't do this. The ones who say no, and the sentence just ends there. No paragraph following it, no nervous smile smoothing it over. They make a decision, and the decision simply stands unaccompanied, unguarded, as if it never occurred to them that it might need defending in the first place. You've probably assumed this is confidence. It is, but confidence isn't actually the mechanism. It's the result. The real mechanism is something more specific, something psychologists have studied closely, and once you understand it, you'll notice, almost uncomfortably, exactly how much of your own life has been spent providing evidence for verdicts nobody asked you to defend. Let's start with the core distinction, because almost everyone conflates two things that are actually opposites. There's a difference between explaining and justifying, and the difference isn't in the words used. It's in the internal reason behind them. Missing this distinction is exactly why so much well-meaning advice about confidence and boundaries ends up feeling hollow the moment someone actually tries to apply it in a real conversation. Explaining, in its healthiest form, is information freely offered because you want someone to understand your reasoning, with no anxiety attached to whether they end up agreeing. Justifying looks almost identical from the outside, same words, similar tone, but it's driven by something else entirely. It's an attempt to prevent a judgment before it happens, to pre-negotiate someone else's opinion of you, to secure their approval as a condition for your own decision feeling valid. This is the exact difference between someone calmly saying, "I'm heading out early tonight," and someone saying, "I'm heading out early tonight because I have an early morning and I've been pretty tired lately, and I just really need the rest, and I hope that's okay." Same fact. Completely different psychological event. One is a person sharing information. The other is a person quietly asking for permission, dressed up as a statement. Here's the uncomfortable question worth sitting with. If nobody challenged your decision, why did you feel the need to defend it anyway? Sit with that question honestly for a moment before reading on, because the answer usually arrives faster than expected once you actually let yourself ask it. The honest answer for most people who do this constantly traces back to a specific belief, usually formed early, rarely examined consciously. The belief that your choices are only acceptable once someone else has understood and approved of the reasoning behind them. Not your own judgment, someone else's. Your internal sense of whether a decision was reasonable gets outsourced, quietly, to an audience that may not even be paying attention. Psychologists have a term for the opposite of this pattern, and understanding it clarifies everything. It's called an internal locus of evaluation. People with a strong internal locus of evaluation determine whether their own choices are valid using their own internal standards first. External approval is nice when it arrives, but it isn't the mechanism deciding whether the choice was correct. People with an external locus of evaluation run the opposite process. Their internal sense of rightness stays suspended, unresolved, until an external audience signs off on it. And because that external approval is never guaranteed, the explaining never really stops. It just keeps auditioning for a verdict that was never actually required. This is why emotionally strong people rarely explain themselves at length. It isn't that they don't care what others think. Most of them care plenty. It's that their sense of whether a decision was reasonable was already settled internally before the other person even walked into the room. The explanation, if it comes at all, is offered as a courtesy, not a plea. Consider two people asked the exact same question after making the exact same decision. Why did you turn down that job offer? The first person launches into a detailed account. The salary wasn't quite what they hoped. The commute would have been difficult. The timing wasn't ideal given some other factors growing increasingly elaborate as they speak, almost as though still trying to convince themselves the decision was sound while explaining it out loud for the first time. The second person simply says, "It wasn't the right fit for me," and stops there. Both people may have made the identical decision for identical reasons. But listen to the difference in how each account lands. The first sounds like someone still processing whether they made the right call. The second sounds like someone who processed that question thoroughly, privately before the conversation ever started, and has nothing left to resolve out loud. This is the internal locus of evaluation in action, visible in real time, in the gap between two people describing the same choice. The reasoning quality isn't actually different in most cases. What's different is where the final verdict on that reasoning got rendered, silently, beforehand by the person themselves, or out loud, in real time, in front of an audience whose reaction still felt necessary to complete the process. Let's trace where the opposite pattern usually comes from, because almost nobody arrives at compulsive over-explaining without a specific history behind it. Picture a childhood where every choice required a defense. Not occasionally. Constantly. Why did you do that? Why do you feel that way? Explain yourself. A household where a parent's mood shifted the moment a child's behavior deviated even slightly from expectation, and the fastest way to prevent that mood shift was a fast, thorough, convincing explanation, offered before the disapproval had the chance to fully land. A child, raised in an environment like that, learns something specific, something that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with survival. Explanations are not neutral information. They're a tool for managing someone else's emotional reaction to you. And if that lesson gets reinforced enough times, across enough years, it stops feeling like a strategy at all. It becomes automatic, the way flinching becomes automatic after enough sudden loud noises fired the instant any decision might invite disapproval, whether or not disapproval is actually coming. This explains something that confuses a lot of adults who struggle with this pattern. Why do you sometimes catch yourself explaining a decision to someone who clearly doesn't care either way? A cashier, a stranger, someone with zero stake in your choice at all. The explanation isn't actually for them. It's for the old alarm system still running inside you, the one built years ago, the one that doesn't check whether disapproval is realistically possible before firing its usual response. There's a specific version of this childhood pattern worth naming, because it doesn't always look like outright criticism. Sometimes it looks like conditional warmth instead. A parent who wasn't harsh exactly, but whose approval clearly depended on hearing the right reasoning behind a choice before offering any sign of acceptance. A child raised in that kind of environment doesn't learn to fear punishment specifically. They learn something quieter and, in some ways, more persistent. That connection itself is conditional on a satisfactory explanation. That love has to be re-earned in small installments every time a choice deviates from what was expected. This version is often harder to identify in adulthood precisely because nothing about it looked cruel at the time. It simply looked like a parent who cared enough to ask why over and over, until asking why stopped feeling like curiosity and started feeling like a toll required before belonging could resume. There's also a version of this that has nothing to do with a difficult parent at all, and shows up instead in households that were simply chaotic or unpredictable in other ways, financially, emotionally, or through frequent upheaval. In an unstable environment, a thorough explanation can function as a genuine safety behavior, a way of trying to control an outcome in a world that otherwise felt uncontrollable. If you couldn't predict how the adults around you would react on any given day, offering an exhaustive account of your reasoning became one of the only tools available for trying to influence that unpredictability in your favor. The strategy made sense then. It simply never got updated once the environment requiring it was long gone. Now here's a twist most people miss entirely, and it reframes the whole conversation. Over-explaining doesn't actually protect you from judgment. It often invites more of it. Think about how negotiation actually works, in any context, personal or professional. A justification once offered becomes something the other person can respond to. It creates an opening. If you say simply, "I can't make it," there's nothing there to argue with. If you say, "I can't make it because I've had a long week and I'm just feeling a bit overwhelmed and I probably should have planned better," you've handed over several separate threads someone could pull on. They can challenge the long week. They can offer a solution to the overwhelm. They can gently suggest better planning next time. Every additional sentence in a justification is, functionally, an invitation to debate something that was never actually up for debate in the first place. This is why the people who explain themselves the least often experience the least resistance. It has nothing to do with charm or authority. It's simpler than that. There's less material available to push against. There's research from negotiation and communication studies that backs this up in a way that surprises most people the first time they hear it. Studies on persuasion and refusal have consistently found that longer, more elaborate justifications are perceived as less confident and, counterintuitively, less credible than short, direct ones, even when the actual content of the longer justification is perfectly reasonable. Listeners tend to unconsciously interpret excessive detail as a sign of uncertainty, as though the speaker is still working to convince themselves as much as anyone else in the room. A short, clear statement, by contrast, reads as settled, and settled statements are processed by listeners as more trustworthy, almost regardless of their actual content. This means the instinct to over-explain in order to seem more reasonable often produces the exact opposite effect, undermining the very credibility it was trying to build. There's a related finding worth mentioning, because it explains something that trips up a lot of people who consider themselves highly rational. Providing more reasons for a decision doesn't make people more likely to accept it. Past a certain point, it does the opposite, because each additional reason gives a listener a new angle to evaluate, and evaluate critically, rather than simply accept. A single strong reason, stated cleanly, tends to be far more persuasive than 5 reasons stacked together, precisely because the single reason leaves nothing extra available to poke holes in. This is sometimes called the dilution effect in psychological research, where additional, weaker justifications actually dilute the strength of an otherwise solid position rather than reinforcing it. Let's get specific about how this shows up across different areas of life, because the pattern rarely stays contained to just one. At work, it shows up as the employee who can't simply say no to an unreasonable request without a paragraph of caveats first, unintentionally signaling through sheer volume of justification that the no is negotiable. if the right counter-argument comes along. Meanwhile, a colleague nearby says, "I won't be able to take that on this week," and somehow the request quietly disappears, redirected elsewhere, without a single follow-up question. In relationships, it shows up as the partner who feels compelled to account for every mood, every quiet evening, every moment of needing space, treating ordinary emotional variation as though it requires a formal report. Meanwhile, the partner who says, "I just need a quiet night," and lets that sentence stand alone, rarely gets pressed further, precisely because the sentence itself carries no uncertainty for anyone to latch onto. This pattern often reaches its most painful intensity during breakups, where one person, usually the one initiating the end of the relationship, feels an overwhelming compulsion to justify the decision in exhaustive detail, as though a sufficiently thorough explanation might somehow soften an outcome that was never going to feel soft to receive. Hours get spent constructing the perfect account of every reason, every contributing factor, every moment that led to this point, offered in the hope that enough clarity might produce something like closure, or at least agreement, from the person on the receiving end. This rarely works the way it's intended to. Grief doesn't resolve through argument, no matter how airtight the argument is. And a person on the receiving end of a breakup is rarely in a position to calmly evaluate reasoning at all. The exhaustive explanation, meant as a kindness, often ends up prolonging the pain instead, giving both people more material to relitigate for months afterward, when a simpler, more compassionate statement might have allowed the actual grieving to begin far sooner. There's a similar pattern worth naming in early dating, where one person feels compelled to explain at length why they're not ready for something serious, why their schedule is complicated, why their past relationships ended the way they did, all offered unprompted, often on an early date, long before that level of explanation was actually being requested. This tends to come from good intentions, a desire to be transparent and considerate, but it frequently reads to the other person as exactly the pattern we've been describing throughout this conversation. Someone who feels their own preferences require extensive justification before they're allowed to simply exist, which paradoxically can make a new partner feel obligated to manage or reassure rather than simply get to know the actual person sitting across from them. In families, it shows up most painfully of all in adult children, still explaining at length decisions that were made years ago, careers, relationships, choices about where to live, as though a parent's understanding remains a prerequisite for their own life continuing to feel legitimate. This same dynamic often continues into a new generation, showing up in how people parent their own children. A parent who over-explains every rule, every consequence, every boundary, treating a child's questioning as a signal that more justification is needed, rather than recognizing that some limits are allowed to simply exist without a full accompanying argument. This isn't about becoming an authoritarian parent who offers no reasoning at all, which carries its own well-documented costs. It's about recognizing that constantly negotiating your own authority through exhaustive explanation teaches a child indirectly that rules are only valid once sufficiently justified, which tends to produce more negotiation over time, not less, because the child has learned correctly that enough pushback might eventually produce a different, more favorable explanation. Parents who hold boundaries calmly, offering a brief, honest reason when appropriate, but not treating every limit as requiring full debate, tend to raise children who experience those limits as more stable and, somewhat counterintuitively, more secure. Children generally aren't looking for endless justification. They're looking for consistency, and consistency is far easier to maintain when a boundary doesn't require winning an argument every single time it gets tested. Here's the deeper mechanism behind all three of these situations, and it's worth understanding clearly because it's the actual engine driving the whole pattern. Every time you over-explain a decision, you're implicitly communicating that your own judgment, on its own, wasn't quite sufficient, that some outside confirmation was still required to fully close the loop, and people, consciously or not, tend to treat you exactly the way you've just taught them to. If your own explanations suggest your decisions need backup, other people will start supplying that backup themselves in the form of pushback, alternative suggestions, gentle challenges, because you've shown them repeatedly that the door was never actually closed. This is the real reason emotionally strong people rarely explain themselves at length. Not coldness, not arrogance, a closed loop. Their decision was settled before it left their mouth, and a settled decision simply doesn't generate the same nervous, over-elaborated language that an unsettled one does. Let's talk about what actually happens in the moment someone chooses brevity over justification, because it's worth understanding the discomfort involved, rather than pretending this transition feels natural right away. The first time you say no without a paragraph attached, it will likely feel wrong, incomplete, almost rude, even when it isn't. This discomfort isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's simply the old alarm system, the one trained over years to treat unexplained decisions as dangerous, firing exactly the way it was built to fire. The silence after a brief, unqualified sentence can feel unbearable at first, like something is missing, like the other person is waiting for you to keep talking. Often, they aren't. Often, the discomfort is entirely internal, invisible to everyone except you. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the crux of the entire pattern. Most compulsive explaining isn't actually happening in response to real external pressure. It's happening in response to an imagined, anticipated pressure, one your own mind constructs before the other person has even had a chance to react. You're not managing their actual response. You're managing your prediction of their response, which is frequently far harsher and far more demanding than anything they would have actually said. There's a specific internal narrative worth listening for here, because it often runs so quietly in the background that people rarely notice it consciously, even while it's actively shaping their behavior in real time. It sounds something like, if I don't explain this well enough, they'll think badly of me. And if they think badly of me, something important will be at risk. That final clause rarely gets spelled out fully, even internally. It stays vague, unexamined, which is precisely what allows it to keep operating unchallenged for years. Pushing that thought a little further, asking directly what exactly would be at risk if this particular person formed a slightly less favorable opinion of this particular decision, often reveals just how disproportionate the anticipated consequence actually is compared to the real practical stakes involved. In the vast majority of cases, nothing substantial is actually threatened. The relationship survives. The job continues. The friendship holds. The old alarm system simply never updated its threat assessment to match the actual, much lower stakes of adult life. Let's talk about a specific practice worth building, because understanding this mechanism intellectually rarely changes the automatic behavior on its own. It's the practice of the pause before the paragraph. In the exact moment you feel the urge to justify a decision at length, pause, just briefly, and ask yourself a simple, honest question. Did they actually ask for a reason? Or am I offering one because staying quiet feels unbearable? This single question, asked consistently, over time, starts to separate two things that have probably been fused together for years: genuine curiosity from someone else, and your own internal discomfort with unexplained silence. Once you can tell those two things apart in the moment, you gain something valuable: the ability to choose whether an explanation is actually useful rather than offering one reflexively every single time, regardless of whether it serves any real purpose. Practicing this in low-stakes situations first tends to work far better than attempting it for the first time in a conversation that actually matters a great deal. Start with genuinely minor decisions: declining a small request from an acquaintance, choosing not to attend an optional gathering, saying you'd rather not discuss something in passing conversation. In these lower stakes moments, practice letting the sentence end without the usual paragraph following it, and notice carefully what actually happens afterward. In the overwhelming majority of cases, nothing happens. The conversation moves on. Nobody presses further. This repeated low-stakes evidence, gathered deliberately over weeks rather than assumed abstractly, does more to retrain the old alarm system than any amount of purely intellectual understanding ever could. There's a second practice worth building alongside the first, and it involves noticing the specific physical sensation that shows up right before you start over, explaining. For most people, it's a kind of tightening, a slight acceleration in speech, an urge to fill space before anyone else has the chance to react. Learning to notice that sensation as it happens, rather than only recognizing the pattern afterward in hindsight, gives you a much earlier window to intervene, back when a single sentence can still stand on its own instead of turning into an unplanned 5-minute defense. This physical awareness matters more than it might initially seem, because by the time the actual words start pouring out, the moment for easy intervention has usually already passed. The real opportunity exists a beat earlier, in that specific bodily tightening, the held breath, the forward lean, the sense that silence has become suddenly unbearable. Learning to simply notice that sensation without immediately acting on it, without rushing to fill the space it's demanding, creates a small but genuine gap where a different choice becomes available. Some people find it helpful to physically exhale in that exact moment, a small deliberate breath that interrupts the automatic momentum long enough for a more considered response to take its place, rather than the reflexive flood of justification that used to follow immediately and automatically. Now let's address something important, because this entire conversation risks tipping into an unhealthy extreme if it isn't handled with care. None of this is an argument for becoming someone who withholds explanation as a form of control, coldness, or manipulation. There's a version of brevity that isn't confidence at all. It's avoidance, wielded specifically to keep someone else off balance, to create ambiguity as a form of power rather than as a natural expression of settled internal judgment. That version isn't emotional strength. It's a different kind of fear, dressed up convincingly as detachment. The goal was never silence for its own sake. The goal is offering explanation as a genuine choice rather than a compulsive requirement, sharing your reasoning freely with people who've earned that transparency while no longer treating explanation as mandatory currency owed to anyone who happens to ask, or even to people who never asked at all. Telling the two apart from the outside can be tricky, since both can look identical for a moment, a person simply not saying much. The real difference shows up over time in whether the brevity coexists with genuine warmth and availability elsewhere in the relationship, or whether it's paired with a broader pattern of coldness, withholding, and strategic ambiguity used specifically to keep someone else guessing. Emotional strength doesn't need anyone kept off balance to feel secure. If brevity is being used as a tool to unsettle someone rather than simply reflecting your own settled certainty, that's worth examining honestly, because it's solving the same old fear with a different, more polished-looking disguise. This distinction matters enormously because healthy relationships genuinely do benefit from real explanation, offered with real care, especially with people you're close to. A partner deserves to understand your inner world, not because their approval is required for your choices to be valid, but because intimacy is built through exactly that kind of shared understanding. The difference isn't whether you explain, it's whether the explanation comes from a place of generosity or a place of fear. Generosity gives freely and doesn't unravel if the explanation isn't fully accepted. Fear gives compulsively and quietly panics the moment the explanation doesn't seem to be landing the way it needs to land. There's a useful test for telling these two apart in the moment, worth applying honestly rather than performing for your own benefit. Notice what happens internally if the person receiving your explanation doesn't seem fully satisfied by it. Generosity-based explanation tolerates that outcome without much disturbance. You said your piece, it was heard, and whether it produced full agreement or not doesn't threaten anything essential in you. Fear-based explanation reacts very differently to the same outcome. An unsatisfied listener triggers an urge to explain further, to add another layer, another angle, another attempt at the exact combination of words that might finally produce the reaction you were originally hoping for. That escalating urge, more than the explanation itself, is usually the clearest signal available that fear, rather than generosity, is actually driving the moment. Let's talk about a fear worth naming directly, because it tends to surface the moment people start practicing this shift. If I stop over-explaining myself, will people think I don't care what they think? Will my brevity be mistaken for coldness, for arrogance, for lack of respect toward the people asking? Here's what tends to happen in practice once the initial discomfort passes. Most people, most of the time, respond to clear, calm, unqualified statements with more respect, not less. Confidence reads as confidence, even when it's quiet. The people who react badly to your new brevity, who seem almost offended that you dare state something plainly without an accompanying defense, are often the exact people who benefited most from your old habit. The ones who relied on your compulsive explaining as a kind of leverage, a way to keep the conversation open long after it should have closed. Their discomfort with your new clarity isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence of exactly what the old pattern was quietly providing them. There's a specific, almost paradoxical experience worth preparing for during this transition. Some people who've known you for years, accustomed to your old pattern of thorough, anxious explanation, may initially interpret your new brevity as a sign that something is wrong, that you're upset with them, that some unspoken tension has entered the relationship. This confusion is understandable given how consistently you train them to expect a certain volume of words attached to every decision. It usually resolves quickly once they experience enough repetition of the new pattern to recognize it as simply who you are now, rather than a symptom of some deeper problem requiring their concern. In the meantime, a brief acknowledgement can help bridge that gap without abandoning the actual shift you're making. Something as simple as noting that you've been working on saying things more directly, without needing every decision to come with an essay attached. There's a particular version of this worth naming that shows up specifically around apologies, because apologizing and over-explaining tend to travel together, reinforcing each other in ways that deepen the entire pattern. Notice how often an apology gets immediately followed by a lengthy explanation of why the thing happened in the first place, as though the apology alone isn't sufficient, as though the other person needs a full accounting of causes and context before they're allowed to accept it. Sometimes context genuinely helps, but often the explanation attached to an apology isn't actually informative. It's defensive, an attempt to soften the apology's weight by immediately supplying reasons that make the mistake feel smaller, more excusable, less fully yours. A clean apology, offered without an attached defense, tends to land with far more weight and far more respect than one buried under paragraphs of context nobody actually asked for. It helps to notice the specific word that tends to appear right at the scene between a genuine apology and a defensive one. The word "but." "I'm sorry I was late, but traffic was terrible." "I'm sorry that upset you, but I didn't mean it that way." Everything after that "but" functions, whether intended or not, as a quiet retraction of everything that came before it, shifting the weight of the apology away from your own responsibility and back toward circumstances or misunderstanding. Removing that word entirely and simply letting the apology stand on its own, sitting with the discomfort of not immediately following it with mitigating context, is one of the fastest ways to notice how much of your explaining has actually been a subtle form of self-protection rather than genuine accountability. Let's widen the lens for a moment, because this pattern connects to something larger than individual conversations. There's a cultural undercurrent worth naming, one that quietly rewards over-explaining, especially for certain groups of people more than others. Many people across different backgrounds and different upbringings were taught early that their competence, their decisions, even their basic right to exist comfortably in certain spaces required constant justification, an ongoing performance of reasonableness offered preemptively, just in case someone questioned their legitimacy. This isn't purely an individual psychological quirk in every case. Sometimes it's a learned survival strategy shaped by a genuinely unequal environment, one where under-explaining actually did carry real social cost. Naming this matters because it means the solution isn't simply willpower applied evenly to every situation. Some environments genuinely do require more explanation than others, and recognizing which environment you are actually standing in rather than assuming every space carries the same old childhood risk is part of applying this shift with real wisdom rather than blanket avoidance. This distinction becomes especially important for anyone who has spent years in professional or social environments where their competence was routinely questioned more than their peers, where a brief, unqualified statement was historically met with more skepticism than the exact same statement offered by someone else in the room. In those specific contexts, additional context sometimes genuinely serves a protective purpose, and abandoning it entirely in the name of confidence isn't always the wisest move. The goal isn't to apply brevity as a blanket rule regardless of circumstance. It's to become conscious of when explanation is a genuine strategic choice suited to the actual room you're standing in versus when it's simply an old automatic reflex firing regardless of whether the current room actually calls for it. Let's return to the emotionally strong people this conversation started with, because understanding their pattern more precisely reveals something worth carrying forward. Their brevity isn't actually about withholding information. It's about where their sense of validity lies, settled internally, before any audience gets involved rather than suspended, waiting on approval that may or may not ever arrive. This means the actual work here was never really about learning to talk less. It was about learning to need less. Needing less external confirmation before a decision feels allowed to exist. Needing less agreement before a boundary feels allowed to hold. Needing less understanding from every single person in your orbit before your own choices feel fully, quietly yours. Here's the insight worth carrying out of this entire conversation, the one that actually changes how you move through your next difficult moment. Every time you catch yourself building an elaborate defense for something nobody actually challenged, pause and ask what you were really trying to secure. In almost every case, it wasn't information the other person needed. It was permission you were quietly still waiting for, from somewhere far older than the current conversation, somewhere that stopped being able to grant that permission validly a long time ago. You don't need it anymore. Not from them, and honestly, not from anyone. The decision was already yours the moment you made it. It didn't require a defense then, and it doesn't require one now. Let the sentence end where it actually ends. The silence that follows isn't empty. It's simply the sound of a decision that never needed anyone else's signature in the first place, and it never will again. It's worth being honest that this shift rarely happens all at once, in a single triumphant conversation where the old pattern simply stops. It happens gradually, through dozens of small moments, some of which will still end in the old familiar paragraph, the reflexive justification arriving before you've even had the chance to catch it. That's not failure. Patterns built over years, reinforced across hundreds of repetitions, don't dissolve the first time you understand them intellectually. They dissolve slowly, through repeated practice, through noticing the old habit a little earlier each time, through gradually collecting enough evidence that unexplained decisions really do survive contact with other people just fine. There's a specific kind of relief waiting on the other side of this practice, one that's easy to underestimate until you've actually experienced it. It's the relief of no longer needing to perform your own reasonableness in every single interaction, of trusting that your internal sense of a decision being sound is actually sufficient, without requiring a courtroom of outside witnesses to ratify it first. This relief tends to show up quietly, almost unnoticed at first, in the specific moment you realize you declined something simply cleanly and didn't spend the next hour replaying the conversation, wondering if your reasoning had been thorough enough to satisfy someone who in most cases had already moved on entirely. That moment, small as it seems, tends to feel disproportionately significant the first time it actually happens, precisely because it's been so rare for so long. Is worth pausing to notice it fully when it arrives, rather than rushing straight past it toward the next decision waiting to be made. Small, noticed victories like that one are usually what makes an old, deeply grooved pattern finally start to loosen its grip for good. This is ultimately what emotional strength actually looks like in practice. Not the absence of care about what others think, but a settled internal foundation that doesn't require constant external reinforcement to remain standing. The people who rarely explain themselves at length aren't hiding anything. They've simply stopped treating every decision as a case requiring evidence, because somewhere along the way, they learned something worth learning for yourself. Their own judgment, arrived at honestly and held with reasonable humility, was always going to be enough. It just took time and repetition and a fair amount of uncomfortable silence to actually start believing it. That belief, once it settles in fully, changes something quieter than confidence and more durable than it. It changes the entire relationship you have with your own decisions, turning them from things requiring outside approval into things that simply, finally, belong to you.